I remember that weekend all too well. It was supposed to be a fun, simple getaway with my friends, a break from work and city noise. We were excited, especially when we found a beautiful old mansion on Airbnb. The pictures showed large, spacious rooms, antique furniture, and a grand fireplace. It seemed perfect. I booked it right away. A woman named Mrs. Warren was listed as the host. Her profile said she'd been renting out her home for years and loved having guests. Her reviews were mostly positive, though one or two guests mentioned odd noises or creaky floors. We laughed it off. Old houses make noises, right? We arrived on a Friday evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the driveway as we pulled up to the house. Standing on the porch, waiting for us, was Mrs. Warren. She was older, maybe in her late 60s, with sharp, bright eyes and a warm, if slightly strained, smile. She welcomed us inside, saying how glad she was to have visitors for the weekend. Inside, the house was as beautiful as the pictures. The wooden floors creaked under our feet, and the furniture was old but polished, like something out of a history book. There was a faint smell, something between dust and lavender, that seemed to linger everywhere. "Now, there's just one rule I need you to follow," Mrs. Warren said, looking at each of us with that same strange, warm smile. "The door at the end of the upstairs hallway is locked. Please don't try to open it." My friend Jake, ever the joker, raised an eyebrow and said, "What's behind the door? A secret stash of treasure?" Mrs. Warren laughed, though it felt forced. "No treasure, I'm afraid. It's just a storage room, nothing for guests to see. Besides, the lock is very old, and I'd hate for anyone to break it." We agreed easily, even though Jake rolled his eyes. A locked room was no big deal, we thought. After showing us around, Mrs. Warren handed me the keys, wished us a good stay, and left, closing the door softly behind her. The house suddenly felt a bit quieter, almost too quiet, like it was holding its breath. The first night was peaceful. We ate dinner, played card games, and laughed by the fire. But when it was time to sleep, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. My room was at the end of the hall, just 2 doors down from the locked room. Lying in bed, I stared at my ceiling, trying to fall asleep, but every creak and groan of the house felt louder in the darkness. And then I heard it, a soft scratching sound. It was faint, but it seemed to come from down the hall. I held my breath, listening. Maybe it was just the wind outside, I told myself, or the house settling. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was too deliberate, too steady. I wanted to wake up Tom, who was in the room next to mine, but I felt silly. Maybe it really was just my imagination. In the morning, I asked if anyone else had heard anything strange. Tom and Emily shook their heads, looking at me like I was crazy. Jake just laughed, saying, "Guess you're just a little jumpy, huh?" But that night, the scratching returned, and this time, it wasn't just me who heard it. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. I'd booked a secluded cabin in the countryside, thinking it would be the perfect escape from my usual routine. The Airbnb listing showed a quaint, well-kept place called Maple Lodge, surrounded by trees and overlooking a small, quiet lake. The host's name was Agnes, and she'd been kind and polite in her messages, even recommending a few nearby trails and cafes. When I arrived, the lodge was even more charming than I expected. It was a single-story cabin with a wraparound porch, tall windows, and a woodsy smell that hit me as soon as I stepped out of the car. Agnes was there to greet me, just as she'd said she would be. She was older than I'd imagined, probably in her late 70s, but had a friendly smile that made me feel welcome right away. "Lovely to meet you, dear," she said, shaking my hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "I hope you'll enjoy Maple Lodge. It's been in my family for decades, so it's got a bit of character." We walked through the cabin as she showed me the kitchen, the small living area, and the bedrooms. There were little personal touches all around. Old black and white family photos on the walls, vintage knick-knacks on shelves, and hand-sewn quilts on the beds. It was charming and a bit like stepping back in time. "Now, there's just one thing to keep in mind during your stay," Agnes said, her face growing slightly more serious. "The door at the end of the hallway, the one with the brass lock, is not for guests. It's a storage room, and it's best left alone." "Got it," I replied, not really thinking much of it. It wasn't unusual for hosts to have a private area in their homes, so I didn't ask questions. She left after that, reminding me to reach out if I needed anything. I watched her walk back to her old station wagon, waving as she drove away down the gravel road. The first few hours were wonderful. I unpacked, cooked myself a simple dinner, and curled up on the couch with a good book. There was no TV or internet, just the soft hum of the forest outside, the crackle of the old wood stove, and the gentle lapping of the lake. I hadn't felt this calm in ages. But as the night wore on, I started feeling off. It was subtle at first, a strange, uncomfortable feeling, like I was being watched. I brushed it off as nerves. I was alone, after all, and the silence was much deeper than I was used to in the city. I was getting ready for bed when I heard it, a faint thump from somewhere down the hall. I froze, listening. The noise came again, a little louder this time, and it sounded like it was coming from behind the locked door. My curiosity kicked in, and despite Agnes's warning, I walked over to the door and leaned close to listen. At first, there was nothing but silence. But then, there it was again, a soft, rhythmic scratching, like something or someone was moving around behind the door. I told myself it was probably just an animal that had gotten in, maybe a raccoon or squirrel. But as the minutes passed, the scratching grew louder, almost insistent, like it was coming closer to the door. I backed away, suddenly feeling an overwhelming urge to leave the hallway. Maybe it was nothing, I tried to reassure myself, or maybe Agnes had warned me not to open the door because she knew animals sometimes got in there. I didn't need to go in. I didn't need to see what was making that sound. But as the night stretched on, the noises continued. It wasn't just scratching anymore. There were faint footsteps, whispers, and what sounded like muffled voices, like someone was talking just beyond the door. The more I listened, the clearer it became, though I couldn't make out what was being said. The voices sounded wrong. They were slow, echoing, and somehow they didn't sound human. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets over my head like a child hiding from a nightmare. I told myself I was just imagining it. I'd been tired, maybe a little stressed, and I was hearing things that weren't there. But then I heard the creak of the door. I couldn't see it, but I knew exactly where the sound was coming from. The door at the end of the hallway, the one that Agnes had told me not to open, was creaking, as if something on the other side was trying to push it open. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, too afraid to move. I didn't dare go look, but the sounds persisted, dragging through the night until finally, sometime after midnight, they stopped as suddenly as they'd started. The silence that followed was so thick, so complete, it was like the whole world was holding its breath. In the morning, the hallway was exactly as I'd left it. The door was closed, the lock untouched, and there was no sign of anything unusual. I tried to convince myself it had all been a bad dream, some trick of the mind brought on by the eerie quiet of the cabin. But that day, I noticed something strange. The pictures on the walls looked different. The faces in the old family photos seemed sharper, more intense, as though they were watching me with an almost lifelike focus. I tried to shrug it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were observing my every move, silently judging me for disturbing whatever lay behind that locked door. As the day wore on, I became more and more unsettled, hearing faint whispers in the back of my mind that I couldn't quite catch. They sounded like fragments of sentences, pieces of stories that I didn't understand. Every time I walked past the door at the end of the hall, my skin prickled with dread. By the second night, I was exhausted but too scared to sleep. I lay awake, listening, waiting, and sure enough, sometime after midnight, the noises began again. The scratching, the whispers, the soft creaking of the door. This time, it sounded like it was opening just a crack, enough for something to slip through. I knew I should leave, but something held me there, frozen, trapped by a mix of fear and curiosity. It was like the house itself didn't want me to leave, like it was keeping me under a spell, holding me captive in its dark secrets. That was the last night I stayed at Maple Lodge. By morning, I had packed my bags, barely able to breathe until I was back in my car, speeding down the gravel road and away from that cursed place. I never saw Agnes again, and I didn't try to contact her. I left a hurried review saying that something had come up, that the cabin was lovely, but that I wouldn't be back. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear those strange whispers echoing at the edge of my mind. And when I close my eyes, I see that locked door, waiting for me in the shadows, daring me to come back and face whatever lies beyond it. I booked the Airbnb without a second thought. I'd been wanting a break from the city and needed a place to recharge, so when I found a quaint room for rent above a small-town bakery, it seemed perfect. The pictures showed a cozy space with vintage furniture, charming lace curtains, and a little balcony overlooking the town's square. The host's name was Eleanor, and she described it as the perfect place for peace and quiet. Her last message before my arrival was unusual, though. She'd written, "A quick note, at night, you may hear noises from below. That's just the bakery settling. Also, please don't try to enter the storage closet at the end of the hall." I didn't think much of it. It's common for hosts to have rooms that are off limits. Maybe she had supplies or personal belongings there. I was just excited about fresh pastries every morning and a quiet retreat to clear my head. I arrived just before sunset. Eleanor greeted me at the door to the bakery and led me up a narrow staircase to the room above. She was in her late 60s, with a calm, quiet demeanor. Her face was soft but expressionless, and though she spoke politely, her words felt rehearsed, as if she had done this same welcome routine many times. The room was even cozier than the pictures. A 4-poster bed sat under a slanted ceiling, covered in soft quilts. There was a small, claw-footed tub in the bathroom, and the balcony looked over a cobblestone street below, with fairy lights strung up between the lampposts. The whole town was charming, like something out of an old storybook. Eleanor left after handing me the key, reminding me once more, "If you hear sounds from below, try to ignore them. The building is old, and it tends to creak at night." That night, I lay in bed, soaking in the silence. It was exactly what I'd been craving. No city sounds, no honking, just the soft rustling of the trees outside the window. But at around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from below. At first, I thought maybe Eleanor was working late in the bakery, preparing for the next morning. But the steps didn't sound normal. They were slow, deliberate, almost shuffling, like someone walking with a limp. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the building settling, as Eleanor had said. But the footsteps continued, moving slowly from one end of the bakery to the other, back and forth, for what felt like hours. The next morning, I was relieved to find the bakery open and bustling. The smell of fresh bread and pastries filled the air, and Eleanor was behind the counter, serving customers with the same calm smile as the night before. I was tempted to ask her if she'd been working late, but I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I kept quiet. That night, I was exhausted and hoped to sleep through any strange noises. But just as I was drifting off, the footsteps started again, slow, shuffling, and somehow deliberate. This time they seemed louder, like they were coming from right below my room. I lay there, holding my breath, feeling a chill creep over me. Suddenly, I heard a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor below. I sat up in bed, listening intently. The noise stopped, then resumed, moving from one side of the bakery to the other, just like the footsteps. It was strange, almost rhythmic, like someone was performing some kind of ritual. I thought about going down to check, but Eleanor's warning about the noises made me hesitate. Instead, I lay back down, pulling the blankets up to my chin, and eventually, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The third night was worse. I was already on edge, waiting for the sounds to start. And sure enough, around midnight, the footsteps began. But this time, there was something else. A low, whispering sound, just faint enough that I couldn't make out any words. It was unsettling, like someone was having a conversation with themselves, mumbling under their breath. The whispering grew louder, filling the space beneath my room. I felt a rising sense of dread, my heart pounding as I lay there, too scared to move. Then, out of nowhere, the footsteps stopped, and the whispering went silent. The sudden quiet was almost worse, like the air itself was holding its breath. I barely slept that night, and by morning, I was exhausted and spooked. I decided I couldn't take another night in that room. I packed my bags, planning to tell Eleanor that I'd have to cut my stay short. As I made my way down the narrow staircase, I saw the storage closet she'd warned me about. I'd avoided it until then, but something drew me toward it. Maybe it was the sleepless nights or my frayed nerves, but before I could stop myself, I found my hand reaching for the doorknob. To my surprise, the door was unlocked. It creaked open, revealing a dim, narrow space lined with old shelves. And there, in the center of the room, was a small wooden stool and a thick, dusty book lying open on it. I stepped closer, curiosity overtaking my fear. The book looked ancient, with cracked leather covers and pages that were yellowed and worn. On the page in front of me was a list of names, written in neat, careful handwriting. I scanned the page, feeling a chill as I recognized some of the names. They were guests who had left reviews for the Airbnb. Each name was followed by a date and a strange symbol that looked like an eye. I backed out of the closet, my heart racing. The footsteps, the whispering. They weren't the sounds of the building settling. Something much darker was happening here. I turned to leave, desperate to get out of that place, when I saw Eleanor standing at the foot of the stairs, watching me with that same calm, unreadable expression. "You shouldn't have gone in there," she said softly, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it. I opened my mouth to apologize, to explain, but she raised a hand, silencing me. "Some guests have a hard time leaving, you know. The forest calls to them. They come for rest, but find other tea things." I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing with questions, but I didn't wait for answers. I brushed past her and hurried down the stairs, out of the bakery, and into my car. I didn't look back. As I drove away, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, but the memory of that list, the eerie symbols and the strange noises haunted me. I never found out what Eleanor was doing or why those names were recorded, and honestly, I didn't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my mind, slow and shuffling, like they're coming closer. And I wonder if I'll ever really be able to escape the room above the bakery.